Hi, welcome. Enjoy the content, subscribe, and turn on notifications.
Ethan Brennan never thought a gesture of love would become the most humiliating moment of his life. At 37, he was an EMT in Denver, Colorado, a job he chose not for the pay, but for the purpose. He woke up at 5 a.m. for 12-hour shifts, came home exhausted, but always with the quiet certainty that he'd made a difference in someone's day. He was a man of simple gestures and measured words, the kind who showed affection through actions rather than grand declarations. That quality, which should have been a strength, became a source of contempt in Julia's eyes. Julia Brennan was 33 and worked in public relations at one of Denver's most prestigious firms. She moved through high-end corporate events, networking dinners at expensive restaurants, and national conferences where powerful business figures exchanged business cards and empty promises. In the early years of their marriage, she proudly introduced Ethan as someone who saved lives, as if his job gave him some kind of romantic nobility. But as her career soared and her salary tripled his, that initial admiration turned into something darker, condescension. Julia began making subtle comments about how nice it would be if Ethan had bigger ambitions, or how some of her colleagues' husbands were so impressive professionally. Ethan listened, swallowed his discomfort, and stayed exactly who he always was. That September afternoon, Ethan had the day off. The autumn sun streamed through the windows of the house they'd shared for 9 years, a comfortable home in a quiet, middle-class neighborhood. Julia had casually mentioned the night before that she wanted to host a few coworkers for dinner, something low-key but potentially useful for professional connections. Wanting to surprise her and show his support, Ethan decided to do it all. He spent the morning at the market picking out fresh ingredients, the entire afternoon in the kitchen preparing bruschetta with tomato and basil, a wild mushroom risotto as the main course, and a homemade tiramisu for dessert. He set the dining table with candles, fresh flowers, and the fine china they hardly ever used. When he finished at 6 p.m., the house was spotless and fragrant. Ethan felt genuine satisfaction, the kind that comes from doing something special for someone you love. Julia got home at 6:30. When she opened the door and saw the set table, the tidy house, and Ethan still wearing the apron tied at his waist, her expression wasn't gratitude. It was something between embarrassment and barely concealed irritation. "You did all this?" she asked, and her tone carried more disapproval than appreciation. Ethan smiled, trying to ignore the strangeness. "I thought I'd help. You said you wanted to host the girls, so I put together a full dinner." Julia looked around, bit her lower lip, and muttered a stiff "thanks" before heading upstairs to change. Ethan stood in the living room, that first pang of discomfort already settling heavy in his chest. The guests arrived promptly at 7. 3 of Julia's colleagues, all elegant women in their 30s, dressed in designer clothes, speaking in corporate jargon Ethan barely understood. And with them, unexpectedly, came a man, Damien Cross. 40, gray at the temples, wearing a suit without a tie, smiling like someone used to being the most important person in any room. Julia introduced him with excessive ease. "This is Damien, partner at the firm. We're working on a big project together, so I thought it'd be good for him to join the conversation tonight." Ethan shook Damien's hand, which was returned with a grip too firm, too territorial. "Pleasure," Damien said, but his eyes already drifted past Ethan as if he were just part of the decor, irrelevant. Dinner began. Ethan served the appetizer, filled the wine glasses, tried to join the conversation, but quickly realized he was invisible. Julia and Damien dominated the table, talking about campaign strategies, difficult clients, engagement metrics. The other colleagues chimed in occasionally, but the real conversation happened between Julia and Damien. Ethan noticed everything, the way she leaned toward him, how she laughed too loudly at his jokes, how she casually touched his arm when making a point. Small gestures, but thick with intimacy. Damien returned them with lingering glances, smiles that lasted longer than they should have. Ethan felt his stomach churn, not with childish jealousy, but with a deep, unsettling intuition that something was very wrong. Then came the moment that would split Ethan's world in half. He just brought out the main course, carefully serving the creamy risotto onto each plate. He was leaning beside Julia, placing her portion, when she turned to the others and said, in what sounded like a casual tone, but loud enough for everyone to hear perfectly, "Ethan is just so helpful. It's not a quality you find in truly successful men." The words hung in the air for an endless second. The colleagues laughed nervously, unsure how to react. Damien, however, smiled with unapologetic arrogance and added, "Well, someone's got to take care of the house while the real professionals are out building empires, right?" The table erupted in laughter, louder now, less uncomfortable. Julia laughed along, turning to look directly at Ethan, who was still standing there with the serving spoon in his hand. She said, with a cruel glint in her eyes, "Exactly. Some men are born to serve. Others are born to lead. You get that, don't you, Damien?" Ethan felt like he'd been punched in the stomach. The noise of the room grew distant, muffled, as if he were underwater. He looked at Julia, waiting, begging, for her to realize what she'd done, to take it back, to say it was just a cruel joke. But she didn't look back. She was busy laughing with Damien, touching his arm again, completely oblivious, or completely indifferent, to the pain she'd just inflicted. Ethan set the serving spoon down, muttered something about not feeling well, and walked out of the dining room. No one tried to stop him. No one asked if he was okay. The party went on without him, and Ethan heard their laughter and lively chatter as he climbed the stairs to the bedroom. He locked himself in the bedroom and sat on the edge of the bed, his hands trembling. It wasn't just the public humiliation. It was the sudden, brutal realization of how Julia truly saw him. Not as a partner. Not as an equal. But as someone inferior, someone who existed to make her life easier, to serve, to stay in the background while she shone. Years of subtle comments, condescending glances, small cruelties disguised as jokes, all of it converged in that moment. Ethan realized, with painful clarity, that the marriage had been dead for a long time. He just refused to see it. At 2 a.m., the house finally fell silent. Ethan heard the goodbyes at the door, the cars pulling away, and then, nothing. Julia didn't come upstairs. He went down and found her asleep on the living room sofa, still dressed, half a glass of wine on the coffee table. She hadn't even bothered to come to the bedroom, offer an explanation, an apology, anything. Ethan went back upstairs, but he knew he wouldn't sleep. The pain of humiliation turned into something colder, more determined. He needed answers. He needed to know if what he suspected was real, or just paranoia fueled by the wound in his chest. At 5 a.m., still awake, Ethan went down again. Julia was still asleep on the sofa. Her personal laptop was on the coffee table, open but in sleep mode. Julia always left everything logged in, never worried about privacy at home. After all, what would Ethan do? He was helpful, domestic, harmless. Ethan picked up the laptop, sat in the armchair across the room, and turned on the screen. Her personal email was already open. He hesitated for only a second before starting to search. He didn't have to search long. The sent folder was packed with messages between Julia and Damien Cross. Ethan clicked on the first one and his heart dropped. They were romantic emails, explicit in intent even if not in language. "Can't wait to see you at the hotel Thursday," read one from 3 weeks ago. "That work trip was incredible, especially the part where we didn't work," read another from 2 months earlier. There were photos, not explicit, but intimate, Julia and Damien in a hotel room, hugging, her laughing the way she used to laugh with Ethan in the early years. Ethan felt sick, but he kept reading. The more he read, the worse it got. In an email from 5 weeks ago, Julia wrote to Damien, "Sometimes I wonder why I'm still married. Ethan is useful, doesn't cause trouble, but he doesn't challenge me. He doesn't make me feel alive. You do." Damien replied, "Then get divorced. You deserve more than a husband who spends his life in an ambulance caring for strangers while you build empires. Julia replied, I'm waiting for the right moment. I need things to align professionally first. But it'll happen. I promise. The messages went on for months. 4 months, to be exact. 4 months of meticulously documented betrayal, hotel meetings disguised as business trips, elaborate lies. In one particularly cruel message from 3 weeks ago, Julia wrote, Ethan made a romantic dinner for our anniversary yesterday. It was sweet, but also sad? I don't know. It made me think about how small he is compared to you. Ethan felt something break inside him, but it wasn't despair. It was clarity. Cold, unshakable clarity. He grabbed a flash drive from the desk drawer, copied every message, every email, every photo. Saved it all. Closed the laptop carefully and placed it back on the coffee table exactly as he'd found it. Julia was still asleep, unaware that her world was about to collapse. At 6 a.m., Ethan took a shower, got dressed, and made coffee. At 7, Julia woke up to the smell of fresh coffee, rubbed her eyes, and headed upstairs to change without saying a word. When she came back down, Ethan was sitting at the kitchen table with her laptop open, Damien's emails filling the screen. Julia froze in the doorway, her face paling instantly. What are you doing? She asked, and for the first time in years, there was fear in her voice. Ethan didn't look up from the screen. Reading about how I'm small, helpful, and useful. Apparently, I'm also sad. Julia tried to recover, walking to the table with false composure. Ethan, you shouldn't be reading my private emails. That's an invasion of privacy. Ethan finally looked at her, and what Julia saw in his face made her take a step back. It wasn't explosive rage. It was something far worse, absolute coldness, crystallized disappointment. Privacy? Ethan repeated, almost laughing. You're serious? You humiliate me in front of strangers, cheat for 4 months, plan to leave me when it's professionally convenient, and you're worried about privacy? Julia tried to minimize it. It was just a phase. I was confused. It doesn't mean anything. Ethan shook his head slowly. Liar. I read it all, Julia. Every message. Every plan. Every insult. You're not confused. You know exactly what you're doing. And I know exactly what I'm going to do now. Julia tried another tactic, her voice rising, almost desperate. Ethan, please. We can talk about this. Go to therapy. Fix it. Ethan stood up, closed the laptop, and pushed it toward her. You have 24 hours to leave this house. Monday morning, I'll file for divorce. Suggest you call Damien and ask if he has a hotel room available, you two are so good at finding them. Julia tried to argue, but something in Ethan's posture, the unshakable firmness, the finality, made the words die in her throat. She went upstairs, made a few quiet calls in the guest room, and by late afternoon, she'd left with 2 suitcases and shock on her face. She truly didn't believe helpful Ethan would have the courage to kick her out. What Julia never knew, and would never know, was that Ethan held a secret that would completely change the narrative she'd built about him. 6 months before that fateful dinner, Ethan's maternal grandmother, a woman named Dorothy Brennan, had passed away at 89. Ethan grew up in a modest family, but Dorothy, over decades, had quietly built an empire. In the 70s and 80s, she bought small commercial properties in Denver's up-and-coming neighborhoods, invested in tech stocks when no one else believed in them, and held on to everything with unshakable patience. When she died, she left a surprising inheritance to her only grandson, a collection of 6 commercial properties now worth fortunes due to gentrification, plus a portfolio of Apple, Microsoft, and Amazon shares bought in the 90s and never sold. The total value of the inheritance, $6,500,000. Ethan received the news through a specialized estate attorney. At first, he was stunned. Then he began processing what it meant. He could retire, travel, change his life completely. But Ethan was cautious. He consulted lawyers, financial planners, wealth management experts. He was processing everything in silence, planning his future, thinking about how to tell Julia at the right moment. But deep down, part of him wanted to wait. He wanted to see if Julia loved him for who he was, a middle-class EMT with a huge heart, or if she was just waiting for something better to come along. The answer came at that humiliating dinner. And now, Ethan knew exactly what to do with that information, absolutely nothing. Julia would never know. Never. During the 4-month Colorado divorce process, which dragged on due to disputes over asset division, Ethan's lawyer, a sharp man named Robert Chin, ensured the inheritance remained completely protected. The inheritance had been received by Ethan after the couple's factual separation, proven by the messages between Julia and Damien dating back before the official split. Plus, the inheritance was Ethan's sole property, never commingled with marital assets, and safeguarded by a family trust. Julia and her lawyer fought fiercely, demanding access to all of Ethan's bank accounts, investments, everything. They found only the joint checking account, modest savings accumulated over the years, and nothing else. Her lawyer even hinted Ethan was hiding assets, but there was nothing to find, at least nothing legally accessible for marital division. In the end, Julia received half of the joint savings, about $35,000, her imported car, and her personal belongings. She expected much more. She expected the house, alimony, for the helpful EMT to have something meaningful to offer. She discovered, too late, that she'd completely underestimated the man she'd humiliated and betrayed. But she still didn't know how much. 3 weeks after the divorce was finalized, Julia and Damien went public with their relationship. Photos of them appeared on social media, dinners at expensive restaurants, trips to Aspen. Julia looked radiant, finally free of the dead weight that was Ethan, finally with a man on her level. The happiness lasted exactly 2 months. The firm where they both worked launched a routine internal audit and uncovered serious irregularities in accounts managed by Damien. He'd been diverting company funds into risky personal investments in cryptocurrencies and failed startups. The amount embezzled reached $500,000. Damien was immediately fired and criminally prosecuted. The investigation expanded, and Julia, as the public relations officer who worked directly with Damien and had signed documents related to campaigns funded by the diverted money, got dragged into the scandal. Though the investigation concluded Julia had no knowledge of the embezzlement and bore no criminal responsibility, her reputation was irreparably damaged. The firm quietly fired her, offering a generous severance in exchange for a confidentiality agreement. Julia accepted, but quickly realized no one else in Denver wanted to hire her. The scandal had spread, and her name was now tied to corporate fraud and unethical behavior. Damien, under federal investigation and without money for expensive lawyers, ended things with Julia via text. "It was fun while it lasted, but I need to focus on my defense now. Good luck." Julia was stunned, alone, unemployed, facing the brutal reality of having destroyed a stable marriage for a man who discarded her at the first sign of trouble. While Julia's life crumbled, Ethan was building something completely new. He retired from his EMT job, leaving behind a 15-year career honored by colleagues and patients. He invested the inheritance wisely, hiring conservative financial managers who generated solid, steady returns. He bought a spacious house in the Colorado mountains near Breckenridge, with views of snow-capped peaks and surrounded by pine forests. But Ethan didn't just want to live comfortably. He wanted purpose. He founded a nonprofit called the First Response Foundation, dedicated to training EMTs and emergency medical technicians in underserved communities across Colorado. The foundation offered free courses, equipment, and even scholarships for young people interested in the field. Ethan invested $1 million of his own money to launch the project, and within a year, it had trained over 200 professionals. Ethan's story caught the attention of local media. A Denver newspaper ran a cover story on the former EMT who used a family inheritance to transform lives. The article included photos of Ethan in his new home, surrounded by students from the foundation, genuinely smiling for the first time in years. The piece briefly mentioned he was divorced, but focused on his journey of overcoming and finding purpose. Julia saw the article. She was unemployed, living in a small rented apartment, trying to rebuild her career from scratch. When she saw Ethan's photo, the mountain house, the casual mention of significant family inheritance, she felt like the ground had vanished beneath her feet. She did the math. 6 months before the separation. His grandmother had died 6 months before. And he never mentioned it. Never said a word. Julia tried to reach out. First, a text, "Ethan, I saw the article. We need to talk." No reply. Then a long email, "I know I made terrible mistakes. I was cruel and unjust. But I deserve to know about the inheritance. We could have had a different life. Please respond." No reply. Finally, a call that went straight to voicemail, "Ethan, please. I just want to talk. I just want. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." Ethan listened to all the messages, read every email, and didn't respond to any. Not out of revenge, not out of cruelty, but because he understood something fundamental: people who humiliate you publicly, who mock your love, who plan to discard you when it's convenient, don't deserve explanations, don't deserve second chances, don't deserve access to the life you build after them. A year and a half after the divorce, Ethan was completely transformed. The foundation had expanded to 3 cities in Colorado. He met Rachel Holloway, a 34-year-old nurse who volunteered with the foundation, teaching first aid in rural communities. Rachel was divorced, a mother to a 7-year-old daughter, kind, intelligent, and treated Ethan with genuine respect he'd forgotten even existed. They started dating slowly, without hurry, building something solid on mutual admiration and shared values. Rachel didn't care about Ethan's inheritance. She fell for the man who woke up early to teach young people how to save lives, the man who listened intently, who made pancakes for her daughter on Sundays, who treated her as an equal in every way. Julia, meanwhile, remained alone. After a year of unemployment, she landed a junior position at a smaller PR firm in Colorado Springs, a job paying 1/3 of what she once earned. She sold her imported car to pay bills, moved into an even smaller apartment, and faced the harsh reality of having destroyed her own life through pride and arrogance. On sleepless nights, when loneliness weighed too heavily, she thought of that September dinner. She thought of the wild mushroom risotto Ethan had made with such care. She thought of the way he looked at her when she said some men are born to serve. She thought of how, in that exact moment, she lost the only person who truly cared about her, not for what she represented professionally, but for who she was, or who she could have been, if she'd chosen to be a better person. Ethan never looked back. He learned, in the painful way only betrayal can teach, that a person's worth isn't in how much they earn, what social circles they move in, or how impressive they look on paper. Worth is in how you treat the people you love, in your integrity when no one's watching, in the respect you offer even when there's no audience to applaud. Julia lost all of that. And Ethan, after losing everything he thought mattered, discovered something far more valuable: the dignity of knowing his own worth, regardless of who chose, or refused, to see it. The last time anyone saw Julia was at a corporate event in Denver, 2 years after the divorce. She was there representing her small firm, trying to make connections, rebuild bridges. Across the room, she saw Ethan. He was in a tuxedo, accompanied by Rachel, who wore an elegant blue dress. They were chatting with a group of local philanthropists, laughing, relaxed. Ethan looked happier than Julia had ever seen him. She thought about approaching, saying something, but when their eyes met for a brief second across the crowded room, Ethan simply looked away and continued his conversation, as if she were a stranger. And that's exactly what she'd become, a stranger who once had the chance to build a life beside an extraordinary man, but chose to humiliate him instead of honoring him. In the end, Ethan and Julia's story wasn't about money, inheritance, or revenge. It was about one simple, relentless truth many learn too late: respect can't be faked, and public humiliation is never forgotten. Julia spent the rest of her life wondering, what if? What if she'd been grateful for the dinner instead of cruel? What if she'd defended Ethan instead of mocking him? What if she'd chosen loyalty instead of betrayal? Ethan, on the other hand, stopped asking questions and started living answers. He found true love, built a legacy of purpose, and learned the most liberating lesson of all: not everyone who loses you deserves to find you again. And as Julia sank into regrets, Ethan climbed mountains, literally and metaphorically, proving to himself, and to no one else, that a man born to serve can choose to serve greater causes, build lasting impact, and live with a dignity no humiliation can steal. Life has a peculiar way of turning pain into purpose. For Ethan, that September dinner was the end of a lie and the beginning of a truth he spent the rest of his life honoring: you don't need the approval of those who can't see your value. You only need to believe in it until others worthy of it recognize it too. Thank you for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you won't miss any updates. See you next time.